Before two people in the Victorian age could openly call it love, they had to pass through a maze of rules, glances, family approval, money, reputation, letters, silence, and very careful behavior.
Before we step into tonight's story, thank you for being here. Truly, every quiet listener helps this little corner of history grow, and it means more than you might think. If you enjoy calm stories from the past, the kind you can fall asleep to or simply drift away with, consider subscribing. It helps the channel continue, and it lets me keep bringing you these peaceful journeys through time. Now, take a slow breath, get comfortable, and let the night carry us back.
And the strange thing is, from the outside, it could look almost peaceful. A young woman sitting in a drawing room, a young man arriving with a polite introduction, tea being poured, a mother pretending not to watch, a father pretending not to judge, a conversation about the weather that was not really about the weather at all. But underneath all of that calm behavior, something far more tense was happening. Because in the Victorian world, attraction was rarely allowed to be simple. It had to behave. It had to be supervised. And for a woman especially, it had to be careful. So imagine we are stepping into a respectable Victorian home in the evening. Not a palace, not the house of a duke, just a comfortable middle-class home, the kind with heavy curtains, a polished table, coal smoke in the air, a piano in the corner, and a family very concerned with what other people might think. The lamps are lit low, the fire is burning in the grate. The room smells faintly of tea, wool, paper, coal, and furniture polish. A young woman sits near the window with embroidery in her lap. Let us call her Clara. She is not famous. She will not appear in a history book, but that is exactly why she matters here. Most people who lived through history were not queens, generals, inventors, or scandalous aristocrats. They were ordinary people, trying to move through the rules of their time without ruining their chances. Clara is perhaps 19, old enough to be watched, old enough to be considered marriageable, old enough for people to begin asking quiet questions about her future. And across the room, near the mantel, stands a young man named Edward. He has been introduced properly. In the Victorian world, a man did not simply approach a respectable young woman and say, "I like you. Shall we go for a walk?" At least, not if he cared about her reputation. He had to enter her world through the right door, through family, through acquaintances, through church, visits, dinners, dances, letters of introduction, shared social circles, or careful invitation. Love could begin with feeling, but courtship had to begin with permission. Edward is speaking to Clara's father. The subject is probably safe. Politics, perhaps. Trade. Railways. The weather. Something in the newspaper. Something that allows him to appear sensible without appearing too eager. Clara is not supposed to stare at him, so she does not. She lowers her eyes to her embroidery. Then she glances up for half a second, then down again. And that half second may be the most honest thing she has done all evening. That is one of the first things to understand about Victorian dating.
A great deal happened in public, but very little could be said directly. People had to learn the language of almost nothing. A glance. A pause. A remembered sentence. A chair placed slightly closer than before. A question asked in a tone that sounded casual to everyone except the one person it was meant for. And because so much was hidden, even small gestures could become enormous. If Edward asks whether Clara enjoyed the music at church last Sunday, he may only be asking about music. Or he may be saying, "I noticed you were there." If Clara replies that she found the final hymn especially moving, she may only be talking about the hymn. Or she may be saying, "I noticed you too." And everyone else in the room may pretend not to notice any of this. But of course, they notice, especially the mother. A chair placed slightly closer than before. Victorian mothers, at least in respectable households, often became the quiet managers of courtship. They watched who visited, who danced with whom, who wrote letters, who lingered too long, who looked too pleased, who seemed serious, who seemed dangerous. A mother might encourage a match without ever saying, "I encourage this match." She might arrange for tea at the right hour. She might invite a young man to dinner again. She might allow her daughter to enter the room sooner rather than later. Or she might do the opposite. A raised eyebrow, a delayed invitation, a sudden errand, a polite but cold smile. In some households, a mother could end a romance before it had learned how to breathe. The father mattered too, of course, perhaps even more when things became serious. But fathers often entered most heavily at the stage of money, prospects, and permission. A father might ask, "Can this man support a wife? What is his income? What is his family? Does he have debts? Is his profession respectable? Will he rise? Will he fall? Is he steady? Is he foolish? Does he drink? Does he gamble? Does he have expectations from an uncle with money?" Romance may have been in the room, but arithmetic was never far away. And honestly, we have to be fair about this. It may sound cold to us, but marriage in that world was not just a declaration of affection. It was an economic arrangement, a legal condition, a social position, and often a woman's main path to security. A bad marriage could trap a woman. A poor marriage could exhaust her. A scandalous marriage could isolate her. A cruel marriage could ruin her life behind closed doors, while everyone outside still called her fortunate. So when parents asked about money, they were not always being heartless. Sometimes they were being practical, in a world where love alone could not pay rent, protect reputation, or make childbirth safe. Still, practicality could be brutal. Some families pushed daughters toward men they did not love. Some rejected kind men because they were not rich enough. Some treated marriage like a negotiation, where the young woman's feelings were only one small item on the table. And this is why Victorian courtship can look beautiful from a distance and feel suffocating when you step inside it. There were flowers,
There were dances. There were letters. There were candlelit rooms and gloved hands and quiet walks in gardens. But there were also rules that pressed hardest on women. A man could recover from flirtation more easily than a woman could. A man could be seen as charming, careless, youthful. A woman could be called imprudent, forward, compromised, ruined. That word, ruined, followed women like a shadow in the 19th century. It did not always mean one thing. Sometimes it meant sexual scandal. Sometimes it meant public suspicion. Sometimes it meant a broken engagement, an indiscreet letter, a rumor, a private meeting, or simply being talked about by people who enjoyed talking. And gossip, in a society built on respectability, could be a weapon. So Clara has been trained since childhood in the art of being careful. She has been taught how to sit, how to enter a room, how to receive a visitor,
How to play the piano without appearing vain. How to speak without seeming bold. How to smile without encouraging too much. How to show interest without revealing desire. Imagine how exhausting that must have been. To be young and alive and curious, and yet always aware that the world is watching how long your eyes rest on someone's face. Edward, meanwhile, has more freedom, but he is not completely free either. He may feel something for Clara. He may admire her. He may think of her after leaving the house. He may remember the way she smiled at some small joke, or the way her hand paused over the tea tray. But if Edward has no money, his feelings are inconvenient. If he is still building his career, he may have to wait. If he is a clerk, a junior lawyer, a shop assistant, a curate, or a younger son without inheritance, love may arrive before he can afford to do anything about it. And that was a real problem. Victorian courtship often depended on timing. A man might not propose until he could support a household. A woman might not be able to wait forever. Families might encourage a more secure match. Another suitor might appear. A fortune might fail. A parent might die. A job might be lost. A ship might sail. And so, beneath all those polite visits, people were often fighting the clock. But let us return to the drawing room. Edward has now been invited to sit. Clara's mother pours tea. Clara passes a cup. Their fingers do not touch. Both of them notice. Nobody else appears to notice. But Clara's younger sister notices, because younger sisters in these stories always notice exactly the things they should not. The conversation moves gently. A new exhibition, a sermon, a cousin's visit, the rain, the roads, a book that everyone has either read or pretends to have read. Edward asks Clara whether she has read it. This is a small opening. She says she has begun it. He says he would be very interested to hear what she thinks when she is finished. That sentence gives him a reason to speak to her again. This is how Victorian courtship often worked. It created future permissions. A book could become a conversation. A conversation could become a visit. A visit could become familiarity.
Familiarity could become expectation. Expectation could become proposal. But every step had to look natural. Too much intention too early could be dangerous. If Edward paid attention only to Clara, he might appear improper. If he ignored her, she might think him indifferent. If Clara spoke too warmly, she might seem forward. If she spoke too coldly, he might withdraw. So they both balance themselves on a narrow bridge made of manners, and the whole family watches to see whether either one will fall. Now, one of the most important figures in this world was the chaperone. A chaperone could be a mother, an aunt, an older married woman, sometimes a trusted companion. Her job was to allow young people to interact while making sure that nothing improper happened.
She was not always dramatic. She did not necessarily leap from behind curtains to stop a hand from being held. Often, she simply existed nearby. That was enough. Imagine Clara and Edward walking in a garden with Clara's aunt behind them. Not so close that she hears every word, perhaps, but close enough that everyone can say the walk was proper. The path is damp from morning rain. The gravel crunches underfoot. Clara carries a parasol. Edward walks beside her, careful not to come too near. He wants to say something meaningful. But there is the aunt. There is always the aunt. So he says, "I hope your family is well." Clara says, "Very well, thank you." A pause. A bird moves in the hedge. The aunt clears her throat behind them. Edward says, "The roses are very fine this year." Clara says, "Yes, they are." And perhaps both of them are thinking, "This is unbearable." But perhaps both of them are also happy, because even this restrained, supervised, almost ridiculous little walk gives them something they did not have before: time near each other. That is another thing we forget. People can make meaning out of very little when very little is allowed. A 5-minute conversation can become precious. A formal note can be read 20 times. A dance can be remembered for months. A glance across a church aisle can make an entire Sunday feel different. At church, courtship had its own quiet possibilities. Families attended together. People saw each other regularly. Young men could notice young women without needing to arrange a visit. Young women could be seen in respectable surroundings. Everyone was dressed carefully. Everyone behaved properly. And yet, beneath hymn books and sermons, eyes still wandered. A young man might wait outside after service. A young woman might pass with her family. There might be a bow, a greeting, a few words exchanged between parents, nothing more. And still, it mattered. Public life gave courtship its stage. Private feeling had to hide inside it. Then there were balls. The ballroom. If the drawing room was a place of restraint, the ballroom was restraint set to music. It was one of the few respectable places where young men and women
could touch. But even touch had rules. Gloves were worn. Introductions mattered. Dance cards might be used, with names written beside dances. A man requested a dance. A woman accepted or declined. Too many dances with the same man could invite gossip. Refusing one man and accepting another too quickly could cause offense. Every movement was social information. Now imagine Clara entering a ballroom. The air is warm with lamps, wax, perfume, fabric, and the closeness of too many bodies. Silk and muslin move under chandeliers. Mothers sit at the edge of the room, watching with the calm intensity of military commanders. Edward sees Clara. He cannot simply hurry across the room and take her hand. He approaches properly. He bows. He asks whether he may have the honor of the next dance. The honor. That word appears everywhere in these rituals, as if everyone is trying to remind themselves that romance must remain respectable. Clara accepts. Perhaps she should not look too pleased. Perhaps she does anyway. When they dance, the room changes. For a few minutes, they are permitted to move together. Their hands meet through gloves. Their steps follow the music. The room turns around them. They are visible to everyone. And yet, strangely, they may feel almost alone. This is part of what made dancing so powerful. It offered intimacy inside permission. It allowed the body to say something the mouth could not. Of course, not every dance was romantic. Some were dull, some were awkward, some were endured for politeness. Some involved stepping on hems, missing turns, or trying to make conversation with someone who had absolutely nothing to say. But when two people already liked each other, a dance could become dangerous in the gentlest possible way. A hand placed correctly, a breath caught, a laugh shared, a moment too brief to be improper, but too vivid to forget. Then the music ends. Edward bows. Clara curtsies. They separate. The spell breaks. Her mother notices whether Clara is flushed. His friend makes some quiet joke near the refreshments. Someone's aunt says they dance well together, which might mean nothing, or everything. Letters were another world entirely. In the Victorian age, a letter could carry feeling across distance in a way that was both beautiful and risky. A letter had weight. It could be held, hidden, saved, burned, tied with ribbon, locked in a drawer, read by candlelight, or discovered by the wrong person. Spoken words vanish. Letters remain. So people wrote carefully, very carefully. Edward might write, "My dear Miss Clara," not "My dearest Clara." Not yet. Not yet, unless there was already an understanding. He might mention the weather, her family's health, a book they discussed, the pleasure of a recent visit. He might write in the language of perfect respectability, while trying to slip one warmer sentence between the safe ones. I have often thought of our conversation. I hope I may have the pleasure of seeing you again soon. I remain with sincere regard. Sincere regard. It sounds cool now, but in the right letter, from the right person, it could make someone's pulse change. Not yet.
Clara's reply would have to be careful, too. If she wrote too warmly, she risked seeming eager. If she wrote too coldly, she risked discouraging him. So she might write, "My dear Mr. Edward." She might thank him for his letter. She might say her mother was pleased to hear from his family. She might mention the book. She might say the weather has been mild. Not yet.
And then, perhaps, one small sentence. I remember our conversation with much pleasure. That is all. But Edward might sit with that sentence for an hour. This was the emotional pressure of indirect communication. When people cannot say much, every word becomes heavy. Of course, not all letters were so cautious. Some were secret. Some were foolish. Some were passionate. Some were written by people who should have known better and carried by servants who knew exactly what they were carrying. A hidden letter could be thrilling. It could also be disastrous. A parent might intercept it. A younger sibling might find it. A servant might gossip. A man might keep letters after a relationship ended. A woman's words, once written, could become evidence against her character. So again, love required not just feeling, but strategy. Where to write, when to send, whom to trust. What to say, what not to say, and whether to keep the letter or feed it quietly into the fire. Now, we should pause here and remember that the Victorian world was not one single world. The kind of courtship we are imagining, drawing rooms, chaperones, piano music, calling cards, careful letters, belonged mostly to middle and upper class society. Working class courtship often looked different, more direct sometimes, more public, less cushioned by parlors and formal calls. Young people might meet at work, in markets, at church, in the street, at fairs, in parks, through neighbors, through family, or on the rare afternoons when they were free. A servant girl might have only a little time off, perhaps Sunday afternoon, perhaps less. She might meet someone while walking with another servant. She might speak to a young man near a gate, at a chapel, or in a crowded street. But even then, reputation mattered. Maybe even more. Because if a servant girl lost her position, she might also lose her room, her income, her food, and her references. For her, romantic risk was not just embarrassment. It could become poverty. A factory worker, a seamstress, a shop girl, a maid of all work, each had her own dangers. She might be freer from drawing room etiquette, but not free from judgment, pregnancy, wages, employers, or hunger. So when we talk about Victorian dating, we must be careful not to imagine only silk gowns and ballroom music. There was also courtship in rain-dark streets,
courtship beside factory gates. Courtship after church. Courtship in letters written with tired hands after 14 hours of work. Courtship that had no chaperone, but many eyes watching from windows. And for many young couples, the question was not, do we love each other?
It was, can we afford to marry? A man might delay marriage for years while trying to earn enough. A woman might wait or be pressured not to. A couple might be engaged for a long time because there was no money for a household. Furniture cost money. Rent cost money. Children cost money. Illness cost money. Even respectability cost money. A poor couple could marry for love and then discover that love had to share a room with debt, cold, exhaustion, and hunger. Still, people did it. Of course they did. People have always fallen in love in inconvenient circumstances. They met when they should not. They hoped when it was impractical. They saved letters. They kept ribbons. They remembered voices. They looked for each other in crowds. The rules were strong, but life was stronger.
And this, I think, is what makes Victorian courtship so fascinating. It was not emotionless. It was emotion under pressure. The pressure of family, the pressure of money, the pressure of class, the pressure of gender, the pressure of reputation, the pressure of time. And under pressure, feelings did not disappear. They became coded. A flower could mean more than a sentence. A dance could mean more than a conversation.
A visit could mean hope. A silence could mean fear. A letter could change an entire week. Flowers, especially, gained a kind of romantic significance. The so-called language of flowers became fashionable in the 19th century. People enjoyed the idea that blossoms could carry messages that society made difficult to speak aloud. A rose might suggest love. Violets, modesty. Forget-me-nots, remembrance. But we should not imagine every Victorian as a walking dictionary of floral codes. Life was messier than that. Still, the popularity of flower meanings tells us something important. People wanted indirect ways to speak. When direct speech was restricted, symbolism became delicious. A bouquet could be innocent in public and intimate in private. A pressed flower inside a book could be nothing, or it could be everything. Calling cards also belong to this world of social signals. A calling card was a small card printed with a person's name. Respectable visiting had rituals. When to call, how long to stay, whether the lady of the house was at home, which did not always simply mean she was physically in the house, but that she was receiving visitors. Edward might leave a card. A servant might carry it in. Clara might hear his name from another room. Her mother might decide whether to receive him. Clara might be invited to join them, or she might not. And that absence could speak as clearly as presence. This is what I mean when I say Victorian courtship was never only about the couple. It was about the household. A young man did not only court a woman. He courted her family's approval, her mother's trust, her father's confidence, her social circle's acceptance, her future's safety. And Clara, if she began to care for him, had to care quietly until caring was allowed to become visible. Now imagine, after several weeks or months, that Edward has visited more than once. He has danced with Clara, but not too often. He has written one careful letter. He has spoken respectfully to her father. Her mother has begun to look less suspicious. A thread now exists between them. Not a promise, not yet, but a thread. One rainy afternoon, he is invited for tea. The room is soft with gray light. Rain taps the window. The fire burns low. Clara pours tea with hands steadier than she feels. Edward takes the cup. Again, their fingers do not touch. Again, both notice. Her father asks about his position. Edward answers carefully. Her mother asks about his family. He answers with respect. Clara's younger sister watches all of this with unbearable interest. After tea, Clara is asked to play the piano. This seems harmless. It is not harmless. Edward is asked to turn the pages. Now he must stand beside her. Close enough to see the music, not so close as to alarm anyone. Clara plays. Edward watches the page, or pretends to. The room hears music. The two of them hear their own awareness. He turns the page at the right moment. This, too, is a form of courtship. Not dramatic, not cinematic in the modern way, but intimate within the rules of the room. When the piece ends, Clara's father says, "Very nice." Her sister says, "You missed a note." Clara would like to vanish. Edward says quietly, "I thought it beautifully played." Nothing improper, nothing excessive. But Clara remembers that sentence later. Not because it was poetic, because it was kind. This is how many feelings grew, not through grand declarations, but through accumulation. A remembered preference, a careful compliment, a dance, a letter, a visit, a silence that felt full rather than empty. And yet, all of it could still come to nothing. That was the danger. A man could visit, admire, dance, write, and still fail to propose. Maybe he had doubts. Maybe his income was not enough. Maybe his family objected. Maybe another opportunity appeared. Maybe he enjoyed admiration more than commitment. And if Clara had allowed herself to hope too visibly, she could suffer twice, once in private and once in public. This is why Victorian women often had to guard not only their behavior, but their expectations. Hope could betray them. At some point, if Edward was serious, he would need to move toward proposal. But even a proposal was not always as spontaneous as novels make it seem. Sometimes permission had been sought first. Sometimes the families had already discussed practical matters. Sometimes everyone knew it was coming except the woman. And sometimes she knew too, but had to behave as if she did not. The proposal might take place in a drawing room, a garden, during a visit, after a long period of growing understanding. It could be emotional, awkward, formal, tender, or terrifying. Edward might ask whether Clara could ever think of him as a husband. Clara might answer at once, or ask for time, or say no because affection was not enough, or say yes, knowing that yes would change the entire shape of her life. And we should not treat yes as a simple, happy ending. For a Victorian woman, engagement did not mean freedom. It meant a new stage of expectation. Now the relationship was public. Now letters could become warmer. Visits could become more accepted.
Plans could be discussed, but now the pressure increased too. Wedding arrangements, money, household goods, family negotiations, the trousseau, the future home, the role of wife, the expectation of children, the fear of whether affection would survive ordinary life. An engagement could be joyful. It could also be frightening. Because marriage was not a date that ended at the door, it was a legal and social bond with enormous consequences, especially for women. A wife's identity, property rights, social duties, and daily life could be transformed. Even in loving marriages, her responsibilities were heavy. In unloving ones, her options could be painfully limited. So when we look back at Victorian courtship, we should not only ask, was it romantic? We should ask, who had power? Who could choose? Who could refuse? Who could recover from a mistake? Who paid the price of gossip? Who had money? Who had freedom? Who had to be careful? And yet, after all these hard questions, we can still admit that there was beauty there. Not in the restrictions themselves, but in the human beings trying to feel something real inside them. The young woman who keeps a letter in a drawer, the clerk who waits until his salary rises, the servant girl who meets someone on her one free afternoon, the shy man who says nothing clever but turns the piano pages perfectly, the girl at a ball who remembers one dance all winter, the couple who speaks mostly about weather because weather is the only safe language available. They were not so different from us. They wanted to be chosen. They wanted to be understood. They wanted security. They wanted tenderness. They wanted someone to notice them across the room and remember. Only the room was stricter then, the consequences heavier, the silence deeper. So tonight, as we leave Clara and Edward in that rain-softened drawing room, do not imagine Victorian courtship as only lace, roses, and candlelight. Imagine the watchful mother, the careful father, the younger sister listening at the wrong moment, the letter hidden beneath a book, the dance card folded away, the flower pressed between pages, the woman trying not to hope too soon, the man trying to become worthy before time runs out. Imagine love moving slowly because the world has placed furniture in its path, and still, somehow, moving. The fire is lower now. The tea has gone cold. The rain taps softly at the glass. Edward is preparing to leave. Clara's mother says the visit has been pleasant. Her father nods politely. Clara says very little. But when Edward bows and looks at her for just a moment longer than necessary, the whole evening gathers itself into that single glance. Nothing has been promised, nothing has been spoken, and yet something has begun. That is where we will leave them for now. Not in a kiss, not in a proposal, not even in certainty, but in the quiet, careful, dangerous beginning of Victorian affection, where love is not yet allowed to speak plainly, but has already found a way to be heard. And that is where we will leave Clara and Edward for tonight. Not with certainty, not with a grand confession, not even with a promise, only with a quiet glance, a room full of rules, and the beginning of something neither of them can safely name yet. Victorian courtship was never only about romance. It was about reputation, family, money, patience, silence, and the careful hope that another person might understand what could not be spoken aloud. So as the fire burns low, the tea grows cold, and the rain softens against the windows, we can leave them there for now, in that delicate space between friendship and love. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight. If this story helped you relax, think, or drift a little closer to sleep, I would be grateful if you subscribed and returned for the next journey into the past. Rest well. Let the day loosen its hold, and wherever you are, I hope the night is gentle with you. Good night.